When there's nothing left but the fire in my chest and the air that fills my lungs, I'll hold my tears and trade
Welcome to
my
Iron
years
Rhetoric
for a glimpse
with your
at
intrepid host,
kingdom
Pastor
come.
Brett
On
McAtee.
the other
Truth forever on the
side
scaffold,
of misery,
wrong
there's
forever
a
on the
world
throne.
we long to
Yet that
see.
scaffold sways the future,
The
and
strife we
behind the
share
dim
will
unknown
take us there
standeth
to
God within the
believe
shadow,
in
keeping watch above his own.
Well, it's been a while since I sat down and done some Iron Ink episodes, and here we are continuing to look at Jeremy Carl's book, The Unprotected Class. It's interesting they inserted the word class in there because that's really a misnomer. The subtitle, though, gets at how anti-white racism is tearing America apart. You would have thought they would have gone with the title Unprotected Race. And I think he even talks about why they didn't. It wasn't going to fly by the publisher, as I recall. And so we get the Unprotected Class, but then we get the thrust of it in the subtitle. And by the way, we welcome you, those that are regular listeners of Iron Rhetoric, and those that are perhaps somewhat new. We're glad to have newbies aboard, and we're glad for the emails that you send. And every so often I get an encouragement from somebody. Once in a while I'll have somebody email me and tell me what a blinking idiot I am. Often I'll get people twice this week, actually. I have listeners. One was in upstate New York asking about Reformed churches that weren't afraid of noticing and were curious if I knew of any up in that area. And then I had another person ask me the same question if I knew anything about in the Rocky Mountain area. That's a big area, but I personally didn't know of any myself. I put feelers out to my contacts and friends. It's just that I get these kind of requests quite often. Well, we are meandering, but we do welcome you whatever time you're listening to this, and we're talking about Jeremy Carl's book. Again, this book was not panned widely. For example, not anywhere near the attention is of Meg Basham's recent book, Shepherds for Sale. That book is lighting up the internet, and I'm actually reading that right now. I may have some Iron Rhetoric podcast on that. But that book is getting a lot of response, a lot of pushback, a lot of defending of it. But Carl's book didn't quite seem to get the kind of response that many books will get. And I think part of the reason for that is just they're trying to drop it down the memory hole, just ignore it kind of idea, and it'll go away. There have been some interviews. I think somebody told me, I didn't listen to it myself, somebody told me that Pope Doug over there in Moscow interviewed Jeremy Carl, and there have been some others as well. I think the Ogden, Utah guys might have had him on as well.
Yep. In the previous podcast, I did list a couple links to a couple of those interviews.
Great.
One of them being the Canon Press, and I believe the other one is with the Ogden guys.
And the Ogden guys are, naturally we don't agree with everybody on everything, but they're doing some good work out there, and we highly recommend most of the stuff that they put out. As we come to this chapter in Erasure of History, we find he has a couple of opening quotes. We'll go ahead and read those. One was from George Orwell, the guy who talked about dropping things down the memory hole. Orwell wrote in his book, 1984, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." And this is why history then is so important. The history that we own, the history that we absorb, ends up serving as the arc upon which we'll travel into the future, and it's how we have a self-understanding of ourselves. And indeed, it's often been said that part of what conquerors do to conquered people is they take away their history. So they have no sense of identity. They don't know who they are. And white Europeans or of European descendants, that's been going on here for quite some time. Been going on in the government schools, at least since the 20th century. You may even want to argue back all the way to Horace Mann when government schools started. But certainly with the rise of, I just drew a blank. and the educators, the well-known educators, Dewey. There we go, with Dewey in the beginning of the 1900s. Carl also mentions a quote from Hegel in his lectures in the philosophy of history. The only thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. That's about as nihilistic as you can possibly get. Reminds me of the story that Rushdoony once told. He was at a conference of historians, and he was at a table, and one of the historians, again, this is a guy who was teaching history for a living, and the guy said, history doesn't teach us anything. It teaches us nothing. And Rushdoony asked him, well, why do you bother? And he said, well, they give me a paycheck, so I gotta come up with something. Yeah. So, I mean, this kind of nihilistic approach to history is part of what we're finding more and more, but also just the changing out of history. And that's been happening again in Europe and in America for quite some time. Our church history is being changed out, and that's all part of the idea of this idea of a replacement theory. Of white people, particularly white Christians, are being replaced. And let's be frank about it again. We've said this before. We'll keep saying it. It's not so much that the problem is white people, white Europeans. The problem is that they've been perfumed with Christ. If white people were, all Marxists to the nth degree, there wouldn't be this hate going on for white people. What the hatred is not really for the pigment of the skin or the particular race. The hatred is for the fact that white people have been perfumed with Christ, and that's been seen throughout history. And so that's why white people are being assaulted in various ways. Carl opens up this chapter with talking about how history is transmitted to the next generation. Of course, that's worldview dependent. Depending on what the worldview is going to be what the history is that's transmitted. So one generation might transmit one set of history to the next generation, but because another worldview sweeps in, that which is going to be transmitted again to the subsequent generation is going to be something very different than which was originally transmitted. It's seldom the case that one generation ever transmits completely a body of truth or a body of facts to a subsequent generation because of the impact of worldviews. But we're finding this erasure of history. And one area that Carl goes into and how we're seeing that is the tearing down of the statues, the tearing down of the monuments, and in their place is being raised up other statues and other monuments. And most often, it's the tearing down of white statues. Indeed, I haven't heard of any other statues being torn down except for statues to white people. It started with the Confederates because they were easy pickings because people are brain dead when it comes to the issues surrounding the War of Northern Aggression. And so the Confederates were an easy initial target. But it's extended even beyond to white people. Columbus, they go after Columbus. They've gone after Lincoln. They've gone after other northern Yankee, Philip Schuyler, for example. And so there's all kinds of different statues that they've gone after. And it's not just that they've torn them down. We need to understand that they've also put other statues in their place. For example, one statue that's gone up was one to a woman, or I guess it was a man, one of the first gender blenders, I guess, was raised in honor of Marsha P. Johnson, who was born Malcolm Michaels. He was a black drag queen who was evidently known within his circles for cultivating an unusual look and having a charismatic personality. Along with a few others, he briefly started a ramshackle group house to take in gay street kids. And that's about it for her redeeming virtues. And so one sign of the fact that people are being conquered is that their statuary is torn down and new statuary is brought up. And a glaring example of that happening was when we invaded Iraq. I don't even know the years now. I can't even think of them off the top of my head. But once we rolled into Baghdad, one of the first things they did is that they took a tank and they somehow put a loop around a statue of Saddam Hussein, and they pulled that sucker down. and were pulling down statues all the way across of Saddam. The same thing happened when communism fell in the former Soviet Union. All kinds of communist statuary was being pulled down. Of course, we would applaud that. We would applaud Saddam's statue being torn down. But the point here is that once the people is conquered, one sign of that conquering is the statuary is torn down and often replaced with other statuary. And we're seeing that happening all over the place here in America. Not only statues, but also sites being renamed. I don't know I wonder how many Martin Luther King boulevards there are in America now. As just one example. And so this is a sign. I mean, this is not just some kind of sidebar thing going on. This is a sign that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant people or white Anglo-Saxon Christian people in general are being conquered. We see an example of that, a glaring example going on in New York. At St. Anne's Church in Buffalo, New York, there it was permanently closed, and it was sold to an Islamic community for $250K. And they're converting the historic St. Anne's Church of Buffalo into a mosque. Now, people might look at that and say, well, that's economics. The St. Anne's couldn't make it, and so they had to, what was the parish going to do with the building? And so they were trying to make a profit out of it. But in the end, what this is communicating is that Christianity is declining and Islam is on the rise. And it ought to make us somewhat sick to our stomachs to understand that this is the conquering process that's going on. We saw the same thing, I would contend, going on in the Olympics with that whole scene of Da Vinci's Last Supper that was mocked, put together by a chap named Jolly. If you understand your European history, it's not uncommon to see evidence of those who, having recently conquered territory, to commemorate and then to widely publicize their victory by replacing the sacred religious symbols of the conquered with those of the conquerors. St. Anne's Church we just mentioned is an example. It was a Christian church, and now we're being conquered, at least in that place, by the Muslims, and so now it's a mosque. But what went on there in Paris was another example. This was mockery, and what they were doing is they were basically stripping the sacred content of the Last Supper and replacing it with a globalist, queer, LGBTQ identity. And what was being communicated there is that Christianity has been conquered. And this is part of what the Erasure of History does. Not only in this regard, but also what will happen is that the conquerors will start moving around populations. Once they conquer a people, they won't leave those people intact in their homeland. They'll move them around to other places, or just as effective, they'll move other peoples into their homelands. And so what we're seeing is that the conquerors are essentially obliterating both us as a people and also our sacred landmarks and symbols, and by tearing down the statuary and by mocking Christian symbols, what's happening is they are communicating that Christianity has been conquered. And of course, again, there's that tandem idea going on here. Inasmuch as Christianity is conquered, obviously that arrow is directed precisely at the heart of Christian white people, because white people have been those who, by God's grace alone, have been perfumed with biblical Christianity. And so when you see these statues going down, it ought not just to be a curio to you. When you see the schools' names being changed, when you see the street signs' names being changed, what's going on here is you're being conquered. The same thing with the idea of the invasion, the combination of the word immigration and invasion, immigration. This is about moving around peoples, and they can get away with it because they have conquered us as a people. If we had an identity, if we owned our history, if we knew who we were and who we are, this could not be successful. We would rise up and we would say this can't happen. But because we have no sense of identity, because we've lost our history, we don't know who we are. They're moving around the peoples. You already know what's going on in Britain, or at least I think you do. I can't take a poll because I can't see out there, but those of you who don't know, Britain's burning down. It's burning down because of protests against the rampant immigration that's flooded into England. A few years ago, the most popular baby name in London, for example, was Muhammad. I don't know if that's still the case, but it was a few years ago. And what happened is you had an immigrant or an immigrant descendant from one of these third world nations killed 3 little Brit girls, and the Brits have had it up to their eyebrows. They've had problems with grooming there. Their girls, their preteens and low teens being groomed, and everybody knows about it. The politicians know about it, but they're getting paid off, and they're turning a blind eye to it. And so this murder of these 3 little British girls by this immigrant or immigrant descendant set off a torch. It was a proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, and now Britain is in flames. France has experienced that likewise in many of its no-go zones. By no-go zones, I mean if you're white, you don't go into that part of a particular city there in France. All of Europe has experienced that. Germany, they've come out with tales about how German women are being accosted by immigrants. The same thing in the Scandinavian countries. It's happening all over Europe, and it's happening here in America as well. We see all kinds of accounts of how immigrants, people who shouldn't be here, are responsible for murder or for rape. And we're reminded that this is all part of what it means to be a conquered people. Now, you can go from conquering into conquering. I mean, it doesn't have to happen all in one bite. But that's what we're looking at. And when we talk about the erasure of history, that's part of what this whole project is. And perhaps the largest part of this erasure of our history is the whole 1619 project that we've talked about before, that's now been implemented in many government schools, where they're basically teaching right up front the evils of the white man and instilling in white children this idea of racial guilt. And the whole idea is that if you can instill them with racial guilt, you can manipulate that guilt, and you can more easily convince them that they need to give over their inheritance, their heritage, to the minority class who are non-Christians. And so this is what Carl is talking about in this chapter in Erasure of History. He considers how they're working to erase the Founding Fathers. He says, the left has inserted anti-white propaganda, falsely presenting America's history as a simple morality tale of evil white explorers and innocent non-white victims. Right? White people bad, minority people good. It's that reductionistic. And so that even that Columbus is seen as being an invader instead of somebody who discovered America. This is the upside downness of this all is seen in the quote from John Jay. John Jay wrote in Federalist Paper number 2, he said, "With equal pleasure I have as often taken notice that Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs." And this quote can be repeated over and over again coming from different founding fathers, or these ideas contained therein. And when you consider what Jay has said here, it's indisputable that what he's saying is that America was founded and formed to be a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. And something along the way, especially in the 20th century, accelerating even more into the 21st century, changed all that. For example, Carl brings out the fact that when you go to many of these historic sites, whether it's Mount Pelier or whether it's where James Madison lived, or whether it was Monticello, where Jefferson was, these are now historic sites. And what you have is many people who are paid by the feds to give tours and to talk about this. But what they end up doing, they don't talk about James Madison, who wrote the Constitution, or Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence and was our third president, Madison, the fourth president. They don't talk about these things. Instead, they concentrate on the PC aspect. what terrible people they were because they owned slaves will end up being a huge emphasis. And I've heard from other people who go to historic landmarks, national landmarks, such as attending Gettysburg or attending other sites, that you're no longer getting American history, you're getting political correctness. And that's because the feds have themselves are now the enemy. They've contributed to all this. They're woke themselves, and they themselves have an interest in replacing the white man. Carl continues with this idea, and of course, this likewise demoralizes the white man. He goes into these historic sites, and he's told about what terrible people the white people were. And just like the kiddies in school are filled with guilt, the effect of this over the course of time fills the people who come and visit with this idea of white guilt. And again, it's easily manipulated. It's gotten so bad that this kind of thing is even going on in our churches. Meg Basham tells of a PCA church in Charlotte, North Carolina, that began guilting its congregation for being white, and started reading Ibrahim Kendi. I don't even know how you pronounce that last name. Critical race theory books, and making the congregants feel guilty, like they'd done something wrong, just for being white. And so Meg Basham tells this story. This erasure of history is all over the place. As we said, the 1619 Project is over and over again. It's funny, they complain about in the 1619 Project, they complain about the fact that black people came here, but they don't explain who it is that sold the black people to begin with. Yes, it's true that black people came to the Americas, but what's also true is it's black people who sold black people. It's black people in Africa who captured other black people in war and sold them in order to gain economically from the profit of selling black captives. So this is not somehow a uniquely European or American problem. It's a problem that needs to be put at the foot of those who supplied. It's not only a demand, it was a supply problem as well. The 1619 Project doesn't erase its history because it doesn't tell about all the white people who were made slaves over the generations and over the decades. It's not like only black people have ever been slaves. White people have been enslaved over and over and over again through the centuries in countless numbers. There are countless books out there that tell this story. But again, the erasure of history, the manipulation of history requires white people to feel guilty, and especially if you're a white Christian who salute the ideas of Christianity that were so influential upon this nation. And so Carl spends time talking about this erasure of history. He talks about the idea that America's own National Archives says that the celebration and valorization of the Founding Fathers is an example of structural racism. All right? And so the erasure of history, or the rewriting of history, is so in-depth, is so notorious, is so villainous, that all the Founding Fathers are seen as guilty of structural racist. And all of this, again, is to the end of conquering us, to continue the conquering process, because it's been started for quite some time, and it will continue to go on until we are the ones, that is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, white Anglo-Saxon Christians, that we are the ones who are in chains and who are enslaved in the countries that our fathers built. Carl continues on with this examination of the erasure of our history. He talks about a noteworthy statue in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, called Silent Sam. It was a monument to a nameless Confederate soldier that had stood on the University of North Carolina campus for decades, and suddenly became, in the 2010s, the subject of a heated political debate. Its removal was never authorized, and in fact, it was forbidden by North Carolina law, but it was torn down by guerrilla action in 2018. And this is what we're seeing a lot of as well in this whole process of conquering, is that the mobs are being set loose. And those that have the authority, they spend their time tutting. No, we don't like that, but they don't do anything to stop this. So they're giving this their acquiescence while at the same time being able to say, well, we didn't want it to happen. And so, again, we see this conquering process continue on. Carl continues talking about history in general, talking about the necessity to understand history in its totality. He talks about the fact that the 1619 Project wants to emphasize how terrible we were to the American Indian, while it ignores the cruel massacres that happened in the other direction as well. This is not to say that there weren't massacres of whites upon Indians, but what's not said in our history is that there were many massacres of Indians upon the white colonists as well. Perhaps the greatest example of that is the wholesale massacre by Native Americans of what's called the Lost Colony in North Carolina, which was the first attempt at a permanent English settlement in America. 80 to 90% of the original settlers at Jamestown died as well, primarily due to starvation or disease, but many at the hands of Native Americans. Now, even there, Carl's being PC himself, because if this book had been written 50 years ago, he wouldn't have called them Native Americans. He would have called them, you know what he would have called them? He'd have called them Indians. This number of deaths would dramatically increase after a 1622 massacre by native chieftain Powhatan. Even obscure incidents such as the massacre of hundreds of European settlers near Bath, North Carolina in 1711 as part of the Tuscarora War left a lasting impression on the colonists' minds. But we're erasing all that history, all that context, and what we're just giving is bad man white. He sell blankets with smallpox to Indians, a dubious claim at the same time. And the Indian is seen as being virtuous, as somebody who was a nature lover and was in contact with nature, and it was the evil Christian white man who came along. A YouTube video that Matt's going to post a link to, we're going to just give you the audio right now, but it gives the perspective of the fact that this is a two-way street. Here they're gathering to sit down, that is Union Blue Coat troops with Sioux Indian, Sitting Bull, and a chap named Colonel Miles. They're folding out the buffalo blanket. They're sitting down face to face, beginning to talk to each other. The soldiers on both sides, braves.
Sitting Bull requested this council. We await his words.
Take your soldiers out of here. They scare the game away.
Very well, sir. Tell me then, how far away should I take my men?
You must take them out of our lands.
What precisely are your lands?
These are the lands where my people lived before you whites first came.
I don't understand. We whites were not your first enemies. Why don't you demand back the land in Minnesota where the Chippewa and others forced you from years before?
The Black Hills are sacred land given to my people by Wakantonka.
Very convenient to cloak your claims in spiritualism. And what would you say to the Mormons and others who believe that their God has given to them Indian lands in the West?
I would say they should listen to Wakantonka.
No matter what your legends say, you didn't sprout from the plains like the spring grasses, and you didn't coalesce out of the ether. You came out of the Minnesota woodlands, armed to the teeth, and set upon your fellow man. You massacred the Kiowa, the Omaha, the Ponca, the Oto, and the Pawnee without mercy. And yet you claim the Black Hills as a private preserve bequeathed to you by the Great Spirit.
And who gave us the guns and powder to kill our enemies? And who traded weapons to the Chippewa and others who drove us from our home?
Chief Sitting Bull, the proposition that you were a peaceable people before the appearance of the white man is the most fanciful legend of all. You were killing each other for hundreds of moons before the first white stepped foot on this continent. You conquered those tribes, lusting for their game and their lands, just as we have now conquered you for no less noble a cause.
This is your story of my people.
This is the truth, not legend.
And so we see there just a film representation of the point I'm trying to make, is that it's not the case that the American Indian was this kind of peaceful native chap who was just kind of minding his own business. They don't tell the history of the Indians. They don't tell how Indians, for example, treated their women, often make them beasts of burden. This should outrage feminists, you would think. And so we get a twisted view of history. And again, the white person is put into the dock. He's the evil guy. He's the bad guy. And so that's just continued to roll along with the critical race theory material that is continuing to emphasize that. And it's all with a view not primarily of cutting off the legs or taking the strength away from the white man, but it's really with a view, as I've said before, of attacking Christianity, of seeking to roll Christ off of his throne. Anyone who thinks whites in America had some kind of monopoly on atrocities with the Indians should check out, for example, the story of the Erie people, for whom Erie County, New York, and Lake Erie are named, or any of the other tribes that were wiped out by other natives who desired their resources and territory. The Erie were eradicated by various Iroquois tribes through warfare, though a few survivors were presumably absorbed by the Iroquois. There were many things that the Indians learned from the whites and vice versa, but neither party needed any instruction in brutal warfare. And so again, this idea that the white man is totally responsible, totally culpable. He alone is the one who sinned. He alone is the one who needs to make apologies and grovel. It's just fanciful. And because it's attacking Christianity, because it's trying to roll Christ off his throne, it makes it all the more despicable. So I'm not having anything to do with it, and I trust that you'll not have anything to do with it either. Even the whole narrative of slavery, which we've tried to poke a couple holes in it, is a narrative that needs to be long examined. I'd recommend reading some Eugene Genevieve's work on slavery in the South. We've already touched on the fact that it was black people who sold black people into slavery. We should also mention the fact that if black people hadn't come here, as horrible as the trip over here was, if they hadn't been over here, they probably would have died in some cannibal's pot. And so inasmuch as they made it here, inasmuch as that they were treated comparatively good to what they would have been treated in Africa had they stayed there, inasmuch as they had lineage and descendants, inasmuch as those descendants profited, in God's providence, I think that it was a good thing. It built up their people and gave them a hope that they would not have had they remained in Africa. Also, in that narrative, we should also mention that America, that is the colonies in America, or the U.S., were not the only places that slaves were sent. Slaves were sent to Brazil, to Cuba, to Jamaica, to Haiti, many of them on the sugar plantations, where their life expectancy was perhaps 9 months. Those people down there, they didn't care. They just looked at them as, you work them until they die, and then we'll get a fresh shipment in. But that wasn't the case in America. Perhaps the treatment of the slaves was not ideal, but it was, comparatively speaking, it was better than what they were going to find in Africa had they stayed there, and it was better than what they were going to get in the sugarcane fields if they had not been bought at that point in the plantations in the U.S. colonies and had instead had to travel down to those sugar cane plantations. And so again, the erasure of history has happened by the fact of telling it from a decidedly warped perspective and not giving the whole context. And we would be glad to say, I would be glad to say, if you give the whole context, there's going to be occasions for seeing that many Europeans, many white people dealt with the American Indian and the black slaves in a way that was despicable. But you just can't paint with a broad brush. You need many fine brushes to paint in the details. But that is not what is happening with the erasure of history, as Carl so ably points out. He tees up the next chapter with the last section in Erasure of History by talking about the erasure of America. Erasing America is the subtitle of the last few pages of this chapter, Erasure of History. He says the ultimate goal of all of this leftist revisionism in erasing America, which is the title of a 2018 book devoted to the contemporary left's all-out assault on history. So they want to remake America, right? You have to understand that's why the border situation is what it is. That's why the left, who's controlled by the globalists, that's why the border is basically non-existent. They want to remake America. Right? What John Jay said long ago about being one people, united people coming from the same descendants, speaking one language, they want to overturn that, all in the pursuit of globalism. One author who's extended that idea is a chap named Howard Zinn in his book People's History of the United States, which is often in many high school history classrooms. It's just a laughable account of U.S. history, and yet that becomes almost a standard textbook that our kiddies are learning. And it doesn't get any better, to be honest, when you go to university. So it's not like, well, when they get to university, they'll get it all sorted out. It's going to be very uncommon to go to a university and get a true understanding or a broad understanding of history. We should say here that history is one of those disciplines that's very worldview oriented. The idea of how you understand history is going to be dependent upon your beginning presuppositions and your understanding about reality in general. For example, if you look at the French Revolution and you get the history from a Warren Carroll, he's a historian, who's a Roman Catholic who would have been a loyalist or a royalist, that's going to be a very different history than if you read a history written by somebody who salutes Robespierre. And that's what's happening with the history here. It's being written by the enemies of America, more importantly, the enemies of Christ. The fact that we see America being erased, Carl brings out in this subsection, when he begins to look at the demographic numbers. He goes back to 1960 census, where in the 1960 census, somewhere in the vicinity of 88% of Americans were white Anglo-Saxon Christian. He breaks that down state by state to demonstrate the fact that the idea that we were, even then in 1960, which again is now 1 year after my birth, in my lifetime, we were 88% white. And there were fewer than 1% of anybody else besides white and black. So you had 88% white, 11%, 12% roughly black, and then a smattering of people who would not fit into those one or two categories. And so if you fast forward and look at where the census is now, we see again that America is being successfully erased. I think we've talked about this before. But those figures that were once 88% white are now down in some quarters to 65%, 67%. And there's already people bragging about how we will soon be no longer be a white majority country. And so this is how Jeremy Carl finishes. And of course, the whole point is that this is not accidental. And we got to get it out of our heads that this somehow is accidental. This has been purposely planned for decades. I would say you go back to the Hart-Celler Act, or what, it was 64, 65, I always get those dates mixed up. But it was being planned even before then to dilute the white Anglo-Saxon Christian population in both America and in Europe. And what's funny is if guys like James White and Doug Wilson want to poo-poo this subject, the idea of kinism and the importance of homogeneity reality in particular countries. If they had been 40 or 50 in 1960, they would have saw nothing wrong whatsoever with the points that are being made here by Jeremy Carl and articulated by myself in analyzing. But now here we are. The worldview has shifted, and so guys like Pope Doug and James White of Apologia and countless others find themselves wagging their fingers at those of us who agree with Jeremy Carl and who suggest that this is a monumental problem, not a small problem, but a monumental problem. Indeed, a problem I don't know that can be fixed. He closes this chapter, and we close this particular podcast with this last paragraph in the Erasure of History. We should not pretend that a great replacement and a great historical erasure have not happened. Even if one thinks that on balance a more diverse America is better, this remains true. What remains true? It remains true that we've been replaced. The point of rewriting our history and tearing down our monuments is to occlude the record of what came before, to make us live in an eternal now where the historical consensus is controlled by a diversity-obsessed regime. And I think that diversity-obsessed regime continues. I just talked to a chap. He wrote me out of the blue. I can't say where because it might he might be able to be located and getting more hot water than he is. He said he had a mild conversation with his pastor about the issue of genetic importance of nations, about the idea of noticing certain things that are not politically correct, approved to be noticed. And he emphasized to me it was a mild conversation. Now, I know I'm only getting one side of the report, but that's what he said. It was a mild conversation. He wasn't all up in the pastor's face, and the pastor was in a conservative Presbyterian denomination. The pastor freaked out, and the next thing you know, the guy was no longer welcome. Now, I doubt if they went out after his membership, but it was made clear that holding these views was not acceptable, and he was invited to leave. And so we continue to have this problem. As I said, I get requests all the time for people looking for race reality, churches that are racial realists. And I more often than not, I have to tell them, look, I don't think I can help you because I don't think there are many churches out there like that. And all of that is because of this erasing of America. And if we don't stand up, if we don't start shouting this out, if we don't start saying, I don't care if I'm going to take it on the chin, I'm going to say something about this, then it's not just America or Europe that's going to go down the can. It's going to be a vibrant expression of muscular Christianity. Christianity is going to go back into the catacombs, and I think that some people are enchanted with that idea. It's almost like they think that's the way it should be. So there's chapter 6 in Jeremy Carl's The Unprotected Class: How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. The chapter is The Erasure of History. And if you're homeschooling your kids, let me say here, it's incredibly important that you give them history that is biblical, it starts from biblical presuppositions, and that honors our fathers. It honors the Christian men that went before us, not only our colonial founding fathers, not only the Black Robed Regiment, which is well known for being part of the founding father matrix, but also the white fathers before that, the European fathers before that who were Christian, who did so much to bring Christ to America. I mean, after all, the German historian Ranke said, as I think I've quoted here before, that John Calvin was the grandfather of America. So we should not find ourselves being manipulated by white guilt. We should not find ourselves apologizing. We have to make ourselves aware of our history, and we have to protect our children by making them epistemologically self-conscious when it comes to their history. Because if they don't get history in their homeschooling experience, a history that is grounded and rooted in biblical Christianity, then they're going to get this white guilt stuff poured upon them, and they're going to want to erase or finally erase their own history. And so this is the word from Iron Rhetoric. Find good history. It's out there. If you want some good recommendations on any particular era of history, you can write me. I might be able to help you. I've read a lot of history. I was a history major in undergrad. And so history is one of my things. But I bet I could probably point you in a good direction for resources. Well, we do thank you for listening to Iron Rhetoric, and we thank you for moving through Jeremy Carl's book. And I trust that you'll get the book yourself and read for yourself what Jeremy Carl has to say. God's blessings on all of the listeners out there, and continue to fight the good fight. God be with you. Good night.
Oh, brothers, can you hear my voice, or am I all alone? If there's no fire to guide my way, then I will start my own.
Thank you for joining us today. Look for us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube Music. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, like, and share.